Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aurélie Martin from the French Chamber of Commerce. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, Perrine Hamel, for our casual AfterLab meeting. So this AfterLab will be nature-based solution for cities in Asia. How do they work and how do we master them? So French Lab Singapore is a joint initiative by CNRS, Ambassade de France, and French Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. So before we start, I would like to share a few rules because there is a lot of participants today for this AfterLab. It's great. So please note that it's registered. So if you have any question also, please feel free to use the chat box and we will check your question during the talk and we will take it during the presentation, but also at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation also, I would like to say that all the video, you can put on your video, and if you have any question, you can raise your hand and we will take also your question from there. So thank you very much, everybody, to attend this AfterLab today. I will pass over to Perrine. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurélie, and thanks to the French Lab for the invitation. Really pleased to be with you today. As already mentioned, I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions in Asia today, and this is very much an informal presentation, so I'll invite all of you to ask questions in the chat box and interrupt. It's the end of the day, and I think we all deserve a conversation more than a lecture. So let's get me started. This is first like to essentially remind you of what I wrote in the teaser, essentially saying that nature-based solutions are gaining quite a lot of attention around the world. I don't know if you read the Straits Times or read more specialized press, or maybe if you're in the younger crowd today, if you're on TikTok and maybe you've seen some posts and videos about nature-based solutions. So there's quite a lot of attention to this term that can also be termed green infrastructure or natural infrastructure. We also see some criticism. I was reading an article a few weeks ago about nature-based dispossession, which is obviously a much more negative take on these solutions. And this one that I found also recently, which has all the buzzwords that would interest a lot of people, maybe French people in particular, also with Total Company, Emmanuel Macron, and essentially claims of financing dictators in Africa. So yes, there are also claims that nature-based solutions are more of a fad and perhaps more about greenwashing than actually providing a way forward. So this is what I'd like to talk about today, essentially giving us all an idea of what they are, what they can do, and what they cannot do. So I'm going to have 4 parts to this talk. First part is essentially what are nature-based solutions. The second part is whether they work or not. And then the third and fourth parts are about nature-based solutions in Singapore and then in Southeast Asia, more kind of research-oriented for those of you who are wondering what are the research frontiers. So nature-based solutions, I'm just going to go back here, are by definitions actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems in ways that address societal challenges to provide both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but you can see that they are solutions. So they address societal challenges and they provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So often this dual function. In practice, they come in many shapes and forms. These would be examples here on this slide. When we think about creating and managing parks in cities, community gardens, they can be very natural as well. This is the Makrichi Reservoir, and some of the primary or secondary forests would also count as part of this green infrastructure. And all these nature-based solutions provide what we call ecosystem services in the jargon, but simply think about them as benefits that we derive as humans. So they can help with air purification, they can help with a lot of the water-related services, flood risk mitigation, water treatment, just because of nature and ecological functions, being able to treat water. And they help with urban heat mitigation. We talk a lot about this with climate change, carbon sequestration, mental health and physical health. So really a broad range of benefits, which makes them very attractive and that functionally explain their popularity. So these were the basic definitions, just to make sure we are on the same page. A few things that may be less obvious. Nature-based solutions can look very artificial. So again, I mentioned that there's a broad range of like natural to man-made or artificial solutions. This is a picture of the Thammasat University green roof in Bangkok. As you can see, it's very engineered and a lot of solutions for water management indeed are very artificial and engineered. So there may be a misconception that we're talking about protecting mangroves or forests. These are parts of the nature-based solutions, but they are also very much, some of the nature-based solutions may look very artificial as well. Another point I wanted to highlight is that we talk a lot about climate nature-based solutions with the current climate crisis. And it's useful to remember that when we talk about climate, there's mitigation and adaptation. So we mitigate climate change by reducing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And we adapt to climate change because we know that climate is changing anyway. And so we need to adapt and think about how to better deal with increased flood risk, with increased temperatures, etc. And so often also there's a bit of a misconception in the way people respond to claims or understand various claims. And this may explain why when we think about mitigation or adaptation. And the third point, which is quite important, is that nature-based solutions involve people. They involve people in the sense that they are designed for people, and they should be, and more the research and practice include like being designed by people as well. And this is because if they are to benefit people, we need to understand how people may use them, if it's a community garden, or how they may indeed benefit from the heat mitigation or from reduced flooding, etc. So that's also an important point. Second section, I'm checking if there's any questions so far. Again, don't hesitate to ask in the chat box. Do nature-based solutions work? Well, this is obviously a really big question, and I'm not claiming to give you the answer. I'm going to give you several elements of this answer, but the short answer is yes. I think there's enough evidence now to say that they work. One way to approach this question is to think about the IPBES report. Some of you may have heard of it. IPBES is the equivalent of the IPCC, that is slightly more well-known for climate change, and that's the equivalent for biodiversity and ecosystem services, meaning that it's an international consortium of scientists that essentially summarize the state of the art, state of science on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so for the first time in 2019, there was this global assessment that was made. And the first message that this assessment sent was that nature and its vital contributions to people, meaning these ecosystem services, are deteriorating worldwide. So it's a bit of a half-empty glass type of answer, but essentially the point is that nature, the lack of nature, we're deteriorating nature. And this means that we are also losing a lot of these services that are here on these slides that are very similar to those that I presented earlier. So the flip side is that if we protect nature, which is part of these nature-based solutions, we will stop losing these benefits. So that's one way to answer this this question. Otherwise, there are, and part of this report is hundreds and thousands of studies looking at the performance of these nature-based solutions. This is a recent review that we've done, looking at which solutions are best for what type of ecosystem services. And obviously, this is a very simplified way of representing this. It's not a binary question, but some nature-based solutions would be better than others for certain types of services. So that's for the kind of general answer of like, yes, they work, like scientists agree that they can be designed to provide all the benefits that people claim they are providing. A couple of recent studies done by some colleagues at NUS that may be of interest to some of you in the audience. I'm focusing on carbon sequestration here, so kind of climate change mitigation, because I know some of you are from the industry or business sector, and so we've heard a lot recently about carbon credits, for example. So part of these nature-based solutions would be to sequester carbon and then claim some of these carbon credits. So these two studies are exactly about this. The first one here is for mangrove blue carbon, so restoration or protection of mangroves worldwide. And they found that about 20% of mangrove forests worldwide already qualify for blue carbon financing, meaning that with the carbon price, with the market price of carbon, it's already valuable. It's already an investable nature-based solution. And they mention also part of this study that with an increase in the price of carbon, I think it's almost 50% of the mangrove forests that become profitable mangrove areas. So that's good news for these type of investments and really highlighting the potential of these nature-based solutions, in that case, mangrove protection. The second study they've done focusing on cities is about urban reforestation. And so looking at where within city boundaries or urban areas boundaries, we can look at reforesting the cities. And so there are two ways to kind of look at this graph. Again, have empty or have full glass. So for a lot of cities, this reforestation potential is actually relatively low compared to the carbon emissions from each city. But for a non-trivial amount of cities, it's like more than 20, 25%, meaning that even reforesting in cities, which is definitely not the first type of nature-based solutions that people would think about, this still has potential in terms of carbon sequestration. So these are two recent studies on these questions. Happy to talk more about this climate mitigation and carbon sequestration potential if some of you are interested. The last point I'll make on this about carbon sequestration is essentially to highlight some of the research we're doing in the lab to think about not only the current restoration potential, but also thinking about urban growth and what we might expect to lose or gain in cities. And so what we've done is, this is work led by a research fellow, Shankar, is looking at the urban areas in Southeast Asia looking at the IPCC scenarios, so looking at future plausible futures in 2050, and looking at how these would actually, what they would mean in terms of land use change in the city. So you can see that for some of them, it means that we're actually losing a lot of forests. Most of them actually means that cities expand, so we're losing a lot of forest, as well as some cropland, etc. And so, of course, these different scenarios mean that we're actually gaining or losing more. Well, the carbon sequestration potential of each of these scenarios is different. So this is an important point to think about the dynamics, and that it's not cities at a point in time now, but also thinking about urban growth as an important driver for carbon sequestration potential. A few points now, moving on to do nature-based solutions work, but in this few slides, do they work for water management? And so this is a study that I've done with a colleague last year, looking at scientific articles in Southeast Asia, and those that were actually focusing on urban water management. So what we found is that most of these papers were about engineered systems. So this is very common for urban water management because we're in very artificial environments. But one of the main points of the studies was that, yes, the hydrologic performance of these nature-based solutions is confirmed. There are a few examples on these slides. In Indonesia, that was about reduction of forested areas that reduce peak flows. So this is about riverine flooding. The fact that paddies in Cambodia, in other cities, in other countries, would help store flood water as well, so reducing inundation as well. And then some of these stormwater quantity or quality, so managing the stormwater in the cities, which is essential for flood risk, again, as well as water quality. So making sure that we are not deteriorating the ecosystems downstreams. So this is essentially all I wanted to share about the do they work for now. I'm gonna pause here and see if you have any questions on this. And if not, what I'll do is go to the next question and ask you to participate in the chat box just to make sure that not everyone is sleeping. And we're moving to Singapore example. So I'm assuming that most of you are based in Singapore. So I'd like you to think about a few nature-based solutions on the ground in Singapore. So you can just write some examples in the chat box just to see if you already have a good knowledge of these solutions. So we have green roofs. Yes, we have a lot of green roofs and green buildings in Singapore. Bishan Park, yes, I'm going to talk about it on the next slide, actually. Planting trees to cool down the city. Indeed, some of you may have heard of the 1 million tree campaign in Singapore. Some Ulupen Park connector. Right, I'll leave you another 10 seconds for additional examples, especially if you have questions about this example, don't hesitate. Yes, so water reservoirs, mangrove conservation projects. Yes, very much so. Very much so. One of the most famous ones. Yes, some of them on Pulau Ubin with the be there, and as well Sungai Buloh, which is now a nature reserve. Great, so a lot of you, all right, not everyone is in Singapore, that's totally fine. You may learn even more today. So yeah, all these examples would be examples of nature-based solutions in Singapore. I'm gonna focus on 2 examples first, and then share a little bit about how these nature-based solutions can be incorporated into planning, which Singapore is very good at. So the first example is, someone mentioned the ABC Waters program. Have someone who knew that I love water-related stuff. And this is indeed one of the largest, I would say, because PUB is like an important program for PUB, which is the water agency in Singapore. And so this program means the Active, Beautiful and Clean Waters program. And what it does is essentially promoting these nature-based solutions, so vegetated solutions to managing our waters in Singapore, to have clean waters, but also active and beautiful. So you see the multiple benefits and societal benefits we were talking about. So one example of some of these systems would be indeed the Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park that someone mentioned. I put this Straits Times article here because I like that when it flooded, when was it, earlier this year or last year? I'm forgetting, I must say. But a lot of people actually tweeted and asked PUB if like the design was completely flawed, which was not the case. So this park was actually designed to have some of these floodplains that would reconnect, and so on purpose would inundate when there's a very heavy storm. So this is a really good example of some of the designs of these solutions where it's a recreational area with a more natural river going through it. And it also really helps alleviate flooding when it's used during wet weather, when there's like heavy storm in Singapore. So this is one of the examples. There are many, many other examples at a much smaller scale. You may recognize the little ABC water droplet on some of the signs when you go along the park connector network, etc. And so they usually flag and have some educational signs when they develop some of these systems. So if you're interested in learning more, of course, there's a ton of really good documentation, because the program is also about educating and building capacity in the industry to design and implement these systems in all new developments in Singapore. And so you can see that in these benefits that are highlighted, that it's not only about water, but also encouraging habitat creation, biodiversity, about the aesthetics. So we're back to these multiple benefits. The second example I wanted to bring up today is the City in Nature strategy that NParks is pushing, and that is at least partly overlapping with the Singapore Green Plan, if some of you have heard about it in earlier this year. And this is essentially a way of promoting more nature and biodiversity in Singapore. As well as really a way of life, I would say, encouraging people to spend more time in nature, to reconnect with nature. So that's part of the ambition of this program. On the biodiversity side, it's already, well, NParks has already done quite a lot. If we think about the nature reserves, this is Sungai Buloh, as I was mentioning, which is really important not only for Singapore but also for regional bird migrations. this is an interesting example as well, the eco bridge that connects the central catchment with Bukit Timah, I believe, which is essentially a way of like building infrastructure for wild animals and to make sure that there's enough connectivity. So this is an example of applying biodiversity principles and really implementing them on the ground to promote biodiversity. So these were two examples that I wanted to highlight. More on the planning level, at the planning level, I wanted to bring up the work that the Natural Capital Singapore, which is a research project that's just concluded. It was ongoing for the past 3+ years, has done. And I'll get to the question in the chat box just after this. So what they have done is essentially mapping a lot of the ecosystem services for Singapore. So you can see on these maps all the services that we were talking about, and they've done like a very extensive mapping exercise. If you're wondering how we get to these maps, they have used geospatial models, actually not this particular one that I'm showing here that I've helped develop and I use a lot in my work, but very similar models. So I think this is good just to get an idea of how we can produce such information. And so essentially these models work like layers, just like you would have on Google Maps or other geospatial platforms. You have these layers of information. Some of them are biophysical, others are socioeconomic, so about who lives where, essentially, or what kind of land use and management we have in the city. And then the model would use this information, so they are mathematical models, to use this information and convert that into the ecological functions and the benefits that one is interested in. So whether it's heat mitigation, this is a map we've done for Singapore, for example, stormwater management, etc. So this is an important part of the research and practice on ecosystem services now, which is to understand how we can map these services to better take them into account. So what they've done also, still work from the Natural Capital Singapore project, is to look at the demand side. So not only do we want to know where ecosystems, where these nature-based solutions do all these functions that will benefit us, but also how people might benefit. So they've done quite a lot of work on like checking if people preferred some services over others, and it turns out that, surprise, temperature reduction ranks pretty high in Singapore, as well as mental health. This was actually pre-COVID, but already an understanding that there are benefits from living around greenery. So there's quite a lot of work that's been done in Singapore around these questions as well. The next last two things that I wanted to highlight from their work about one, equity. So I mentioned that nature-based solutions were like involve people and should involve people in the design as well. And this is one lens that one can take to think about these questions, thinking about distribution of services and whether urban planning is actually providing these free services in an equitable way to citizens living in the city. These questions are actually getting a lot of attention in Europe, in the US, where there are a lot of either areas that are gentrified or historically poor or from minorities. Some of these neighborhoods would actually have less trees, less vegetation. And so not only you are disadvantaged economically or from other types of oppression, but also you have less free benefits from all these ecosystem services. And so some of this work is emerging in Singapore as well, which needs more attention to understand how we can make it more operational for planning. And the last point is about this science being actionable and really used in practice. And so here as well, the work that they've done is getting at this, but from conversation with the colleagues, they would acknowledge themselves that it's still at the very beginning. This type of thinking of using ecosystem services data for new town development. This is for the Tengah town in the west of Singapore, is not mainstream yet. So it's at the very premise, because agencies have other ways of thinking about how to design new towns, but it's arguably a very important next step in the way we plan our cities. So this is all I wanted to say about Singapore. If you have questions, please type them, and I'm going to read the question in the chat box. What is the business case for such urban nature-based solution projects? They seem to be all municipal projects funded by government. How can private investors bring in capital for such projects and find returns? Yeah, really good question. So I'm trying to think about what I presented. For Singapore, it's actually a mix. So if we think about green roofs and perhaps, you know, the iconic Oasia Hotel or Park Royal on Pickering, these very nice green hotels that are on a lot of brochure. These would be private investments, and the return on investment is obviously in that case with the tourism and the value of the real estate itself. So that's an example, I would say, of private investment. There are other ways, especially when we think about urban water management. Perhaps this was also when I was talking about this. In the case of Singapore, it is PUB, so the water authority, bearing the cost of a lot of these systems when they are in public open space. But some of these nature-based solutions or ABC systems would also be on private land, and in that case, same thing, it would be the private developer. We have one on NTU campus, a couple actually, and so these were the costs were borne by NTU. There are also hybrid systems with the kind of pay-for-service management systems, where a private contractor would actually implement these new solutions, vegetative solutions, and only get paid by the municipality if they reach a certain level of performance. And so this is some of the newer financing models that cities can use to kind of invest without having to disperse the capital in the first place. So this answers the question. So private investors, and I'll talk about some work on the insurance companies that is also related to this question of like who's bearing the cost of these investments. I'll take another question. Let me check the time. All right, perhaps I'll actually save these really good questions that I see coming up for the end. I'll give a few examples in Southeast Asia, so we can have a more meaningful discussion, maybe with our videos on, who knows. So what about our neighbors in Southeast Asia? Three things very quickly to keep in mind when we think about these solutions in Southeast Asia. There is very rapid land use change in Southeast Asia, and this means that we are encroaching on a lot of land and so losing a lot of these services. That's important. I'm going to talk very briefly about this, but it's an example in Indonesia. One of my students is working on this, and as you can see, land development goes extremely fast, and this is the kind of cities that we see happening. And so you can imagine the environmental implications as well as the social implications when we think about equity and who benefits from the new houses and development and who loses as well. So that's an important factor to keep in mind. Presence of informal settlements is also very important, not in Singapore, but in many of our neighboring countries. It can be up to 50% of the population, urban population, living in slums. So that's an enormous challenge in itself when we think about investment in green or gray infrastructure, when we don't know who is on the map, essentially. And then, of course, climate change, which is an important driver and incentive for us to use this nature-based solution. So I had 3 case studies. I knew I would not have time to go through the 3 of them. I'm gonna give you the highlights of each so I can wrap up in 5 minutes, and then we can go more into details if need be. So the first one is urban heat mitigation in Vietnam. And so this is an exploratory study that I've done with colleagues at the World Bank, which essentially looks at how greening strategies can reduce temperature and reduce energy consumption. So the type of thinking that we've done for this project is actually quite typical of a nature-based solution project, where we applied this model I was talking about to look at the difference between a current landscape and a future landscape. And then knowing where people live, we can overlay this information and think about and see where this change in temperature would actually help reduce the energy consumption for air conditioning. And then you can relate that to CO2 emissions, for example. So in that case, we've done these 2 scenarios, current scenario, and then green space conservation. So all the red would be the urban areas. So it's kind of counterfactual. If we are not protecting, then this may turn urban. And so this is the scenario we've looked at. And then green space creation, which is implementing road trees. And so when we look at the numbers, they're actually very low reduction, and these are estimates from preliminary model runs, very low reduction. So the cooling effect is actually less than 1 degree for all the scenarios, which really doesn't look like much. But there is a but. The relationship between temperature and energy consumption for air conditioning is actually really steep. This relationship here, this is for data in China, which means that even with these modest cooling effects, we're actually reaching about 5% of the energy consumption for these residential areas, which is actually not insignificant when we think about other types of infrastructure, as well as other types of benefits that one might gain from this greening strategy. So I just wanted to highlight that as a way of thinking about these greening scenarios and how we can, in practice, think about investment projects that look at these benefits. The second case study is essentially applying a risk framework in Myanmar. This time, this is work that we've done with a few colleagues from the US, from Myanmar, and from Singapore. And what we've done is for the basin of Chinwin, which is in northern Myanmar, we've actually, I'm going to move to the next slide directly. We've looked at how much flooding we might expect, again, with the current and alternative scenario. What are the assets that are exposed to this flooding, and how they may be impacted, how vulnerable they are to flooding. So this is also a very kind of typical workflow for looking at the benefits or at the risks of flooding, but it's actually not very mainstream when it comes to nature-based solutions. So doing this, especially for a poorly gauged a basin where there's not a lot of data, is actually relatively novel. And what we've found is that, first, forest cover does have a significant impact on flood risk. And this is what I mentioned before. Yes, these do work. Nature-based solutions are most effective against small storms. So it's like for the storms that are not, very frequent, but not so intense that they are most effective. And so we can compare for the two scenarios when this protection would actually, the level and the extent of this protection by nature-based solutions. And so they're most effective against small storms, but this is actually really important because these small storms, as I mentioned, are very frequent. So it's these very frequent flooding events that, if you annualize all these losses, are going to have the highest impact on the economic losses in that case. So that's an important finding for this particular basin, but in general, really an invitation to think about the way we conduct these studies, when they involve nature-based solutions. So I'm going to skip this section, which is a bummer because it's work that I really enjoy starting, but it's very much work in progress. So very happy to talk about this with some of you if you are interested. So essentially the question is informal settlements and nature-based solutions are a good idea for this project. And so these are all very preliminary results. So to conclude, nature-based solutions are natural or artificial. They can be for climate mitigation and adaptation, and they are ideally by and for people. They provide a lot of co-benefits. We've talked about this throughout the talk. And in Singapore, we already use them for a lot of things: water management, biodiversity, and kind of increasingly for urban planning in general. In Southeast Asia, a lot of examples that already exist, and some of the research frontiers that I mentioned are nature-based solutions for new cities that are rapidly growing, for informal settlements, and then this idea of mainstreaming the green-gray comparison methods that I touched on briefly through this flood example. With that, I'm going to thank my team who is working with me on all these questions. You can find more information on our website, and I'm going to take some of the questions that I see in the chat box. I'll stop sharing so I can see some faces. All right, so Aurélie, I'll just read a few questions.
Yeah, I think we have already a few questions in the chat, but also if you want to directly ask your question, please raise your hand and put your camera on, and yeah, we take it.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and start with Alina's question on the work on equity. Which socioeconomic variables were used to assess ecosystem services whether they are distributed equally. In the work that I presented from memory, this was income. So the colleague working on these questions had a survey, socioeconomic survey for Singapore. And so they looked at where people with higher incomes, whether they had higher access to greenery around them. So they had spatial data both on greenery access and their incomes. They also did some work on race as well, so kind of disaggregating the data by race, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others in Singapore. And so part of the work we are starting to do with the team here is to look also at other populations that are often not in the stats, the official stats, including foreign workers. We have foreign workers dormitory in Singapore, and looking at how they might benefit from ecosystem services as well, because very often, as I said, they are missing from the official socioeconomic statistics.
Thanks, yeah, very interesting.
All right, I'll check the next question, which is, what are the challenges, difference to implement nature-based solutions in developing countries versus developed? Yes, this is a very good question that I touched on by talking about informal settlements, but of course that's not the only difference. So obviously access to funding is an important difference, where if you have more funding, like perhaps PUB in Singapore, to implement some of these solutions, that's one less barrier that than one might have. Trying to think, because this question is, I think if we think about it in Southeast Asia, there may be other cultural differences, but in general, developing versus developed, I would say that finance and governance are the main two barriers. So when we think about governance, is whether there is capacity in government agencies to actually develop a program promoting nature-based solutions and then implementing it as well. And whether there are corruption issues or other kind of structural, institutional issues in developing countries that it's definitely not unique to developing countries, but this is something that may be an even higher barrier. I'll keep going with the next question. What do you think about possible individual family HDP level nature-based solutions to improve the equity of ecosystem services distribution? Can I ask Angil to clarify the question, just so I make sure I can answer it properly?
Hi, Perrine. Actually, what I meant by the question was basically that if like for individual homes here and in HDB void decks, if there are maybe solutions that can add, like that can be an extension of already existing city level nature-based solutions, do you think they will improve equity or like to people who don't have access right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Interestingly, the existing work on equity in Singapore suggests that it's already very equitable, and this is mainly because of the way the estates and towns were planned in Singapore, also with a racial mix and spread out across Singapore. So this explains a lot of these, why a lot of these equity indicators actually are really good for Singapore. So there's one point or counterpoint to that is that, as I mentioned, not everyone is actually counted in these statistics. So foreigners, whether they are foreign domestic workers or foreign workers, non-residents would not be counted typically in some of these statistics. So that's a nuance to these existing studies that, as I mentioned, are only emerging in Singapore. But in general, the point about thinking at the HDB estate level is a very important one. And yes, adding some greenery close to some estates that are less, have less access to greenery would definitely have a direct impact on all these benefits.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
What about more nature-based solutions plus optimized building architecture to cool down buildings instead of freezing aircon? I cannot agree more. Yes, so nature-based solutions are not the only way to cool temperatures in the city. And urban design is probably even more important than planting trees or having green roofs. So thinking about the density, the canyon effect, so how close the buildings are, how high they are, thinking about ventilation, etc. So all these architectural elements in a neighborhood or in a building would be extremely important. So now landscape architects and architects really think about both nature-based solutions and these broader contextual elements to make sure that we're not cooking in the future. All right, Kevin, are there problems of greenwashing with NBS? If so, are there any universal standards that qualifies an NBS? Greenwashing, yes, I think with like any environmental policy or solution, we do see that, and part of a lot of the research that I do and that many people do is about quantifying the benefits. So the review I mentioned, for example, in Southeast Asia on urban water management is looking at the evidence from models, but also from empirical data, like actual measurements. So this is really important for researchers and practitioners to some extent when they can help with that, to also ensure that the systems we are designing do work. And as I mentioned, not all nature-based solutions are good for all the services. They may be for carbon sequestration, for example. I was saying that for some cities, it's quite a lot of potential. Other cities, very low potential. So saying that planting 1 million trees in Singapore is going to offset our emissions is absolutely untrue. I'm not saying that someone said that, but very often, if you don't think about the details, they can be lumped as an ideal solution for everything that they may do. Whereas in practice on the ground, they may only kind of tick a few boxes. So that's where it's important to do the research and study the particular system in its particular environment to actually see if they are doing what they are doing, what they're saying they do. Universal standards, yes. At different levels. So IUCN has actually now kind of a guidelines and standards, I think they're called standards, for nature-based solutions that are all the principles that, and all the boxes that any nature-based solution should tick to be considered as such. So that's something to check, maybe the IUCN standards. But then we can think about the ABC Waters guidelines, for example, and these would be considered standards for Singapore. PUB has determined from their review of the literature and from their experience that these were the minimum standards that a system should have, and this can be used more in a more context-specific way.
Perrine, we have a few more questions. Yeah, I know Noemi also would like to add something.
Yeah, I have a question. So I was wondering, are there any potential risks of nature-based solutions? So are there any unwanted consequences of having all these, nature promotions in cities? Could animals be competing more with humans as a result, or any other unwanted, consequences that you may have researched on? I would be interested in hearing more about that.
Yes, and maybe I'm also doing some greenwashing by not mentioning what we call disservices, which are this kind of negative side of nature-based solutions. There are indeed a number of them. They are studied for sure. You mentioned the human-wildlife conflicts. These can be an important one. We have macaques on campus here at NTU, and not everyone is very happy about the situation, to say the least, and for good reasons. It can be scary, and so this would be like more nature, great, but we're not always deciding what type of nature is getting closer to us. Mosquitoes would be another example. There are also, for air quality, a number of disservices. Trees would actually have pollens or VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that would actually increase air pollution. So yes, this is part of this study, and what I was mentioning about not just saying that all trees are great and equal, but thinking about in a given situation, are some of these disservices important as well, and how can they be mitigated?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's already time. Maybe we have one more question, maybe. Yeah.
I'll take one more. Okay, yeah. Are there other ways to retrofit urban cities with green and blue infrastructure other than planting more trees? Would it look like rebuilding buildings or converting to green roofs? Yes, and yes. So adding, but retrofitting is obviously often more difficult than building from scratch, and hence the opportunity I mentioned for rapid urban growth, where these cities are actually being built right now. And in general, I would say, like vacant land in cities, this is something we're actually looking at with a colleague and students at the moment, how to best use these vacant lands in Singapore. So yeah, most of these solutions can also be thought of as in terms of retrofitting, and that's often what we have to do in cities that are already built.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Perrine, for the presentation. It was very interesting, and thank you all for your participation tonight. I just wanted to highlight, I just put in a chat box, a survey for French Lab. It would be very great for us for the next AfterLab, if you can have, your think about the AfterLab, and for other session, what you would like to have in terms of talk as well. So you will see the link. You can respond today or tomorrow morning. It would be great. So I would like to thank you again, Perrine, for this great presentation. Thank you also, French Lab team, Nicolas, Boris, and Noemi for the organization as well. And thank you all for the participation. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Perrine.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Perrine.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Bye.